Alright, so my presentation is going to be about tropical deserts. So, tropical deserts are located in various places around the earth. Because of their really hot and dry climates, they typically have an average temperature of around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they have an average of almost 0.25 centimeters of precipitation annually. But this can change in between deserts based on their location on the earth. The desert of Chile, for example, has an average of 1.8 centimeters of rain annually, whereas deserts in America have almost 28 centimeters of rain per year. So, because of the harsh conditions that deserts have, there are only a few types of organisms that are actually suited to live under such harsh conditions. Some of these organisms include small lizards, such as thorny devils, and it even includes larger animals, such as coyotes, owls, ground squirrels, vultures, scorpions, camels, and even cougars in some places. But one example of how an animal has adapted to the conditions of the desert is the very own camel, which has humps on its back that are made of fatty tissues that actually allow it to regulate the temperatures in its body so that it's able to tolerate the harsh temperatures that deserts can have. So, even though it's very minimal, there's actually a lot of diversity in deserts. So even though it varies in between them, some of this vegetation can include barrel cactuses, brittle bushes, chainthroat kala, crassia bushes, crimson hedgehog cactuses, etc. Oh, and various types of weeds. So interesting facts about deserts. So, a researcher named Knives actually determined that because of all the amount of solar energy that they receive, deserts actually receive more energy in 6 hours compared to all of the energy that the entire human population uses in an entire year. Also, because of agricultural and global climate changes, 46,000 square miles of arable land is lost to deserts, is converted into deserts in the process known as desertification. And the world's largest deserts are actually located on the poles, which include, I was about to say North and South Pole, Antarctica. A desert doesn't exactly have to be extremely hot, but it has to have very minimal amounts of precipitation and groundwater that, allow an area to be actually classified as a desert. And actually, you can actually grow potatoes in the desert, which is something like I had no idea about. Isn't science amazing? So, alright, so threats to the desert, tropical. So the acronym HIPPO, habitat destruction, introduced and invasive species, pollution, population, and overexploitation. So going into habitat destruction, even though a lot of people consider deserts a wasteland, there are actually areas of large amounts of diversity that have small communities of organisms constantly interacting with one another. So one major factor that is destroying deserts is global warming. This is because the vegetation in deserts are already adapted to certain changes in the climate and the temperatures of that single desert. So if it were to go slightly above, which is what global warming is doing, then all of the vegetation in a given area can potentially die off. So another anthropogenic factor that causes the destruction of deserts is nuclear waste disposal, in which we actually dump all of the radioactive material excess that is used in military or other institutions into deserts. This can harm the environment by by the roots of the vegetation that actually absorb some of these nutrients and typically kill off everything. So because large amounts of organisms depend on the vegetation, then if the vegetation were to suddenly disappear, then all life in deserts would typically be reduced to nothing. This can also be applied to irrigation systems that nearby populations in deserts actually integrate so that they can support small amounts of vegetation, but in the long-term process actually harm the populations of vegetation that were actually already present in a single desert. So introduced an invasive species. So two types of weeds that I was able to find out that were threats to deserts were the bufflegrass and onion weeds. The reason why these weeds are a great threat to deserts is because they populate the area in such a fast amounts that they deprive nearby vegetation of the essential nutrients that they need, such as nitrogen and water. So if all of the vegetation that organisms used to depend on were to suddenly die off, then the ecosystem would collapse on itself. So people are trying to find ways to combat and regulate the population of these weeds. So pollution. So as I mentioned before, we are humans are typically dumping nuclear waste into deserts, into small deposits of land that, in the long-term process, immensely affect the vegetation nearby and eventually dies off because of the radioactive materials that they absorb through their roots. So this can also be applied to the nitrogen enrichment system, in which farmers typically use types of fertilizer so that they could try to support small vegetation that is able to live in deserts. So, population. So, nearby people who live around deserts actually have an agriculture that kind of sort of coincides with the biome's conditions, meaning that they try to grow vegetation that would be kind of natural to the environment, but they're, yeah. So another anthropogenic factor that really damages that nearby populations are doing that actually damages the environment are roads, which block off vegetation from receiving appropriate amounts of sunlight, and they typically again deprive vegetation of essential nutrients that they typically consume in an average day, which in the long-term process severely damages the wildlife that is around, that is present in these deserts. So, overexploitation. So, deserts aren't these areas of wasteland that everyone thinks they are. They have this diversity within them that actually is able to consider them really important to the earth. But a manner in which humans are exploiting deserts are by depriving an area of the underground aquifers that are actually the main sources of water for deserts. So in the Sahara Desert, for example, it's thought that there's typically 30,000 cubic kilometers of water stored in an aquifer underground the land. So if a human population city were to deprive or like suddenly take up all of the water that is in these aquifers, then nearby vegetation, which is, by this point the base of an environment, if it's deprived from them, then they wouldn't be able to live or survive in the manner that they're supposed to. So any organism that lives off them, such as owls or other lizards that are primary consumers that typically rely on them as a food source, are unable to acquire the nutrients that they need in order to live. So these processes in the end severely damage deserts. So how people are trying to help deserts nowadays. So because deserts are becoming very minimal and large areas of wasteland, people are trying to support them by making them greener in a sense. Um, there are organizations are trying to plant samplings that are adequate enough to be able to live off in the desert, so that the diversity and larger amounts of vegetation could be present for nearby organisms to use for survival. So another manner in which people are trying to help deserts is by conserving the most amount of water that they can, especially in cities that are extremely nearby deserts. So by doing so, vegetation and wildlife would be able to receive the appropriate amount of water and necessities that they need to in order to kind of live. So these are the resources that I used in case you would want to go into your own in-depth research. And I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation.